down. I'm the one you call when you need a 10 up or down. I'm a tent rental man, I'm working all day, getting those stakes in the ground no matter what they say. From sunrise to the night, I make sure everything's right. Yeah, I'm a tent rental man, I'm working all day.
Welcome back to another episode of Under the Vinyl. As always, I got my co-host Kyle. Kyle, how are you?
Hanging in there, Nate. I'm alive. How are you today?
I'm just glad you got your coffee so we could get through the rest of the day.
Yeah, I needed it.
I think I need to do that myself. But we got a great guest lined up for today. I think this is a hot topic in our industry, just with labor in general as a whole. So we got a good guest on to talk about kind of just labor and H2B and things like that. So we're going to jump right in here. I got Tom. Tom, how you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. Tom, if you could kind of tell us who you are, what you do, and kind of what you got going on.
So I'm Tom Bortnyk. I'm the Senior Vice President and General Counsel for masLabor. If you don't know who we are, masLabor is the leading provider of H2A and H2B visa services in the United States. Collectively, we're responsible for about 70,000 foreign workers a year. Probably about 40% of that are H2B workers. And so we do a lot of work in the non-immigrant visa space, trying to help employers solve complicated labor needs.
Perfect. Now, I know in the news there's a bunch of things about H1B recently. Can you just kind of give the listeners the differences between H1 and H2?
I'm glad you asked, because this is a lesson that our own president needs to maybe get a better understanding of, because he actually is an H2B program user. President Trump has done a number of media statements and things like that where he talks about supporting H1B. In reality, he's talking about H2B. So probably the best way I could describe the difference is that H1B is really for specialty occupations. It's used a lot in the tech sector. You see kind of the large accounting firms, large tech companies making heavy use of the H1B program, predominantly to bring in professionals from India and China. And of course, that program is subject to a lot of scrutiny for good reasons and, just general political reasons. What makes the H2B program different is that, one, it's really not designed for these sort of high-paying jobs, right? It's for manual labor, typically, in labor-intensive industries, and it's more for temporary and seasonal jobs. H1B is for year-round employment. You can basically stay here for many years on an H1B visa. With H2B, it's really about solving kind of the labor challenges of businesses that experience significant fluctuations throughout the year. So it's really about temporary jobs during peak periods of demand for certain businesses. And that's why it's heavily utilized predominantly by the landscaping industry, but also outdoor amusement, obviously events and weddings and hospitality, and some of these more traditional seasonal industries make heavy use of the program.
Why does the tent and event industry rely so heavily on H2B compared to other labor options, you think?
I think it's that so many event companies do have that fluctuation throughout the year, right? I mean, it stands to reason that, especially depending on what geography you're in, the bulk of your business might fall into the warm weather months, right? You may not be doing a ton of business over the winter. And so that creates a unique labor challenge, because in order to sort of staff up and be able to fulfill all your obligations during the busy season, you need a certain staffing level. But when the tide turns and you start dwindling and you start doing much less business, you can't justify a staff of that size. So a lot of businesses, you try to hire seasonal workers, you try to hire temporary help. Increasingly, though, there are just fewer Americans that want to be employed on a temporary basis, right? American workers typically have more job opportunities at their disposal. You're seeing a lot more Americans, especially younger Americans, going into the gig economy where they have true, they can be an Uber driver, they can be a DoorDash driver. They can do any number of things that give them greater flexibility. And that's really not the case with some of these very labor intensive seasonal jobs. And the more important thing is that if you are interested in, manual labor, if you are interested in very labor intensive jobs, you probably want steady employment year round, right? You don't want to take a job for 6, 7, 8 months out of the year. You're looking for steady year round employment. And so in absence of a large number of US workers that are ready, willing, and able to take those jobs, somebody has to do the work. You have to get your labor somewhere. It's not like robots are going to replace the jobs anytime soon. So that's why increasingly a lot of these businesses are just turning to the H2B program.
So, is there a misconception that it's cheap labor?
100%. That's probably one of the biggest misconceptions. I'd say the two biggest myths in the H2B program are it's cheap labor and it's replacing American jobs. There's nothing in the data that bears out either of those two things. If you look at, I'll speak to the taking American jobs thing. As I mentioned, it's designed to fill a shortfall. So there's no Americans being displaced as a result of it. In fact, as a condition of participating in the H2B program, you have to go through and actually try to recruit local US workers. So there's actually a preferential hiring requirement. And so hiring foreign workers becomes sort of a last resort, not a first option. On the wage piece, the government sets the wage rate. It's not a market-based wage where you can go in and pay people whatever you want. You literally have to apply to the government and say, this is what I want the workers to do, and these are the specific locations where I want that work to be performed. And the government has wage data that says this is the rate you need to pay if you're going to do that job in that geographic area. And of course, those government set wages are based on private sector employment, and they set it artificially high so that it actually becomes more expensive to employ foreign workers.
Yep. What I've always wondered, how are they determining what these people should be paid? Is there, obviously said there's data, so there's some formula they're running and they're pulling data from other employers around the area to figure out, they're basically polling people to figure out what the best wage is?
In a sense. So if you really want to dive into the methodology, the way it works, so the Department of Labor has the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's a big bureaucracy that does a lot of data analysis about the labor market. What they do is they have a wage survey process called Occupational and Employment Wage Statistics, OEWS. And they basically go out and they survey private sector employers and they ask, what are your employees doing? What tasks are they doing as part of their day-to-day jobs? And how much are you paying them to do that? Then they go back and they sort of aggregate that and they compile it and they come up with a county by county determination so that in every geographic location in America, you can look up any occupational code. Every job is broken into a very bureaucratic occupational code. And you can look up what a prevailing wage would be in that county. Now, where it gets interesting is you can get some really weird results, right? Like you can go to any landlocked county in America and look up the prevailing wage for a ship captain or a first mate, and the government will have data on it. We had a client in Pennsylvania that's one of the only tire manufacturers. They make specialty tires for like race cars and stuff. So they're one of the only true tire manufacturers in the eastern United States. And sure enough, there's a tire builder wage data. And they say, well, how the heck did they get this wage data? I'm like, well, they must have surveyed you. They must have surveyed you on what you pay your employees because you're the only one in the entire eastern United States.
So you're basically then just relying on somebody within that industry to set the wage, and that's how they're getting the info.
In theory, right? So it's based on, in theory, it's supposed to be based on non-H2B employers, so people that are not using the program, and they're going to try to come up with a wage methodology that, they break it down according to skill level in the wage data. So you have anywhere from entry level to seasoned veteran, at the upper end of the experience spectrum. Where they set H2B wages is right at the mean. So it's sort of an average of all possible skill levels for an occupation averaged together to create one wage. That is the wage that has to be paid the H2B workers.
And Do you have to pay all your staff that wage, or is it just your H2B staff?
There is a concept called corresponding employment, and it's this idea that it kind of harkens back to the whole point of the program, which the program is an America First program, right? You have the U.S. recruitment requirement, you have preferential hiring for U.S. workers, but you also have to ensure that you're not giving preferential treatment to foreign workers on the terms and conditions of employment, right? So they created this concept called corresponding employment, which is that if you are a U.S. worker doing that same job, you're entitled to the same benefits and terms and conditions and protections as the H2B workers, and that would include the wage rate. Now, in the H2B program, they did kind of create a carve out if you are what they call an incumbent employee. So if you're employed in that job year round, you're kind of exempt from that corresponding employment requirement. But it would really apply in the case of seasonal U.S. hires. So if you do end up going out and you hire a seasonal U.S. worker, you really need to ensure that you're paying that seasonal U.S. worker the same or comparable wage rate as the H2B workers.
This episode of Under the Vinyl is brought to you by Anchor Industries, a fifth-generation, family-owned American manufacturer of tents and clear span structures. Anchor has spent decades engineering products that last season after season, and they're more than just your supplier. They're a partner committed to helping grow your business. And right now, Anchor's winter discount is live. Get 15% off frame, fabric, and accessories for your tents and clear spans now through January 26th. Make sure you let them know Kyle and Nate sent you. Contact your sales rep today. Call 800-544-4445 or visit anchorinc.com to learn more. So we've talked about the wages in the program. Everyone always talks about a lottery, which is what people kind of use to scare you away from joining the program, I'm convinced. Let's kind of dive into the application to the lottery, and then we can work our way through finally getting the people here.
Sure.
Give us the details of kind of the application process from kind of start to finish on the boots on the ground part of it.
Well, first of all, it's a bit of a misnomer to even call it a lottery, right? Because a lottery implies that you have winners and losers. That's sort of, you get your lottery ticket and you either are a winner or you're a loser, and it's sort of a binary choice. The reality is a little bit more complicated than that. So just to start off, it's sort of important to understand when you're talking about the H2B application process, you're dealing with three separate federal agencies, right? You're dealing with the Department of Labor for all the things that I already talked about with wages and all that stuff. U.S. recruitment. You're talking about the Department of Homeland Security, which actually administers, they are the primary administrator of the H2B program. And then you have the State Department, which actually issues the visas. So Homeland Security doesn't issue the visas. That comes from the U.S. State Department at all the consulates and embassies around the country. So the process of getting H2B workers here is really that passing of the baton, right? It's moving from one federal agency to the next. Congress, back in 1990, imposed a cap on the number of visas that can be issued in a single year, right? So it is capped at 66,000 by statute, divided into two equal allotments. So every half of the fiscal year, you have an allotment of 33,000. So starting October 1st, you get 33,000. Next allotment becomes available April 1st.
And these are B visas only.
H2B, right, yeah.
Yep.
So there's a finite number that goes around. That cap is administered by the middle government agency, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which is part of Homeland Security. They're the ones actually administering the cap and counting it. The issue is they process on a first-come, first-served basis. So when you file your H2B visa petition, it's really how quickly you can file that petition with Homeland Security to get in before that cap allotment is exhausted. The problem with that is that there's an entire government stage prior to that, right? You have to go through all these hoops with the Department of Labor. So the lottery came about not as a means of picking winners and losers per se, not in a direct way. It came about because there was so much attention on the fairness or lack thereof of a process where everybody submits their applications to DOL at the same time. They process it in some undetermined order, And the next stage of the process is first come, first serve. So if DOL happens to process your case earlier, you have an unfair advantage over someone who DOL just decided to, for whatever reason, process at a later time, right? So the lottery was really a creation of the Department of Labor to figure out an equitable way to process applications and give priority to some over others. And that is sort of the primary determinant of how quickly you can get your petition to the next stage. And thus, it becomes an indirect way of kind of policing the cap and making sure that there's an orderly process for doing that.
So at what point should you really start preparing for that process?
Well, ideally, you would start no later than October or November, because the filing window, the government loves ruining everybody's holidays. So the filing window for H2B opens 90 days before the cap allotment becomes available. So if you backtrack 90 days from April 1st, which is when the spring visas become available, it's New Year's Day. So they ruin New Year's for everybody.
Of
If you
course
backtrack
it is.
from October 1st, it's July 3rd, so they're ruining another holiday there. So for the spring allotment, right, you're filing your application on January 1st. So New Year's Day, you're submitting that application and filing it off to the Department of Labor.
So I take it your staff doesn't get a holiday on that day.
We have a good time coming in the night before and turning it into a party as best we can as we submit application after application at the stroke of midnight.
Is there a
So that you're starting at midnight to put them in.
It's an interesting tradition. It started because everybody got burned one year. So before they actually had the lottery, which gives you a 3-day window to file applications, they actually did it by timestamp. So the sooner after midnight you press the submit button, that was your spot in line. Now, fortunately, they don't do that anymore, but you would not believe the number of longtime H2B clients that are superstitious about it, and they will ask us, how soon?
What time did you put it in?
So we've just accepted our fate and said, all right, New Year's is ruined. We're going to send everybody in and we'll just submit them as quickly as we can, and then we'll have the next day off.
And so what happens if you miss that deadline? Is there any kind of grace period at all whatsoever? It's just like, sorry, you're out of luck. We're the government.
You can certainly submit your application after that, but you're going to be at the back of the line, and chances are the visa allotment is going to be exhausted by the time they get around to your application. Is generally how it works.
So then what's the worst last-minute scramble you've seen or you've had to do?
Well,
because I'm sure there's a story there.
I mentioned, the October, November being kind of the latest to get started. And that's because there is a process for getting that wage determination that I mentioned. So that is a process that can take anywhere from 1 month, kind of on a normal timeline, to sometimes more than 2 months. And that all depends on how quickly DOL can turn those around. So we had a client that enrolled probably around Thanksgiving time. And they say, hey, I really want to make the New Year's lottery. How do I get in? Well, we have to turn around a prevailing wage and just cross our fingers and hope that DOL processes that in time. Because if we don't have a prevailing wage in hand, we can't enter the lottery. And if we can't enter the lottery, then you're screwed on the visa cap, basically. Now, fortunately, in that case, I don't know, DOL's heart grew 3 sizes that day, or they decided to, throw us a bone. But they did manage to issue the prevailing wage, I think, December 30th. So right down to the wire it came down to.
So what kind of information would a company need to gather in order to get everything ready for their initial application? Let's just say they're a first-time user of the program.
Yeah, there's several things that you need to be thinking about as a first-time user. One is just figuring out what you need the workers to do. That's probably the first thing that you need to decide, right? Because the first stage in that process is that prevailing wage. It does take 1 to 2 months generally. So if you're starting sometime in the late summer, early fall, that's kind of the ideal time when most folks get started. Those are the decisions you're going to have to make, because you're really not going to get a second bite at the apple. If you file a prevailing wage determination and you list all your job duties, you get your prevailing wage back, and then you say, "Oh, crap, I forgot this whole stack of duties that I needed the workers to do." Well, we don't really have enough time to turn around another prevailing wage determination, right? So you're kind of stuck with what you have. So yeah, figuring out what you need the workers to do and how much you're prepared to pay. And we can do kind of a preliminary analysis. We can figure out, okay, based on the duties you gave us, this is what occupational classification we think it's going to be. This is what you can expect to pay based on the worksite locations you listed, and you can kind of figure that out. Probably the next thing that's increasingly important is having good business documentation to substantiate your need. So one of the things the Department of Labor has done probably in the last 5 years is really crack down on employers that can't adequately demonstrate a temporary need. So these would be year-round businesses that don't really have that seasonal ebb and flow. So the Department of Labor,
they want to see a revenue ebb and flow. Is that ideally what they're looking for?
they want to see a change to the labor need. And so they want to see that your business is not constant in all 12 months of the year. Now, there's a couple different ways we can show that. We can show that by revenue. We can show that by a breakdown of man hours. We can show that by if you have, more contracts in at a certain time of year than others. There's no strict requirements as to what type of evidence we have to show. But for new program users, the expectation from the Department of Labor is that you do show that you have a true seasonal need, and not just a need for workers during a particular time, but they want to see that you justify the actual number of workers you're requesting. So if you say, hey, I need 50 workers, you need to have good evidence that shows that you did your math, whether it's a breakdown in man hours, a breakdown of employees relative to revenue or sales or whatever it is. You need to be able to show your work on how you arrived at that workforce. And that's sort of it kind of goes back to this idea of policing fraud and abuse, right? They want to make sure, given that there's a finite number of visas available, they want to make sure that people are not inflating their labor need and saying, well, I need 100 workers when really I only need 50, or maybe I only need 10, right? New employers, ever since the Department of Labor instituted this registration process, where if you're a returning user and you're not making year-to-year changes, either to the period of need or to the number of workers, you're sort of grandfathered in and they're not going to scrutinize you. That's good if you're a returning employer, right? If you're a returning program user, you kind of can escape a lot of the added scrutiny. It has given the Department of Labor a lot more time to focus on new program users. And so where we've seen, returning users be subject to less scrutiny, that scrutiny has now amplified on the new employer front. So people just getting into the program are subject to a lot of scrutiny by DOL.
So would you think then that's probably one of the biggest pieces of paperwork that owners need to look at the most to really come up with those numbers, and something they don't really think about?
People that want to do the H2B program the smart way, it behooves them to do their diligence on the front end. Because if you can put together a thoughtful statement of temporary need, if you can basically write a letter, and this is something that if you're working with an agent or an attorney that can help you with this, putting together a thoughtful, compelling argument as to why you meet the regulatory standards will help avoid that scrutiny and it'll get you that instant approval rather than a notice of deficiency where they start asking for 3 years worth of payroll and very burdensome document requests. Kind of the reason that's important, again, this is all time sensitive. USCIS, they process things first come, first serve. So if you experience a delay at the DOL stage because you're under scrutiny and you have to furnish a bunch of documents, that can be make or break on your case, especially if you're in a later lottery group. So if you're in the kind of front of the line, you're probably okay. You can survive some scrutiny. If you're borderline, every single day that goes by makes the difference between, meeting the cap or not beating the cap. So if you get a 7-day delay as a result of scrutiny by DOL that forces you to turn over 3 years of payroll, that can be fatal to your case sometimes.
Well, and it kind of rolls us into our next topic here is just how much has H2B increased over the years here. Like, I feel like you just keep hearing it, that it keeps going up and up and up, driving the cost up, which then people try to find more people that are local, and that's really tough. The labor is just tough in general, but seeing that increased price, it kind of pushes people away. And then I think they kind of underestimate the housing, transportation, and compliance costs altogether, to roll that all in. So just how's that cost been increasing, and what does that look like? And what do you think people underestimate the most?
Wages have certainly gone up. I think that's one of the things that has been most certain over the last few years, is that wages have gone up in the program. And that is certainly a deterrent to at least some people getting into the program. On top of the wages going up, you have the uncertainty factor, which is that it's very difficult for you to run a business on a lottery system. I mean, you're essentially gambling every year of saying, I'm going to pay thousands of dollars to a consultant to help me with this, and I may come up empty-handed, right? There's a chance that I'll pay for all this professional work that goes into preparing this very complicated set of documents to submit to the government, and I may not even get my workers, right? I may get my workers late, right? That certainly factors in, and there's a higher turnover rate and attrition rate in the program to people that have not been in it that long, right? So the long-time users, the people that have been using the program for 5, 10, 20 years even, they tend to stick in the program whether they have a successful year or not under the lottery. And sometimes, some years they have good lottery results, some years they have bad lottery results, but they stick with it. If you're a new business, that's a tougher pill to swallow. And so we tend to see a higher dropout rate of people saying, yeah, I tried it last year, I'm not going to give it a go this year because it just didn't work out. And, the cost factor, I think it really comes down to just the level of competition, people getting into the program. Now, I will say demand for the program has sort of plateaued. It's been rather constant after a couple of years of pretty rapid growth. What's interesting to me is that the predominant new program users that we're seeing are sort of in non-traditional industries. You've sort of plateaued as far as landscapers or hospitality or construction or some of these more traditional industries. With those folks, you're either sort of in it and you know the program, or you're hanging out, avoiding it for as long as you can. What's been interesting to me is that as the economy changes, and we're starting to see labor shortages elsewhere, we've seen increased demand from daycare centers, right? Or summer camps, or just sort of these very non-traditional uses of the program that are desperate for labor, that are now turning to H2B because there's no other, viable alternatives out there.
Yeah, absolutely. But then I feel like at that point, your pricing models need to change because of the risk of H2B as well, as a company.
It does and it doesn't. So one of the things that we haven't really talked about is cap relief and the supplemental visas that for the last 6 or 7 years has been steadily made available, right? So it is true that the program is capped at 66,000. That's the baseline amount. But that number has been hit pretty consistently over the last decade, right? Where program usage has exceeded the available supply, in some cases several times over. I mean, you're talking 3 or 4 times as many people apply for the H2B program as actually get visas from that initial allotment.
Which is just crazy to think.
Right, and that speaks to the fact that that's just the reality of the labor market today. It also speaks to the fact that Congress has not updated that since 1990, and we've changed a lot as a country since 1990, right?
Well, I mean, this might be going backwards to what you're going to say. Was there not a returning exemption at one point for a few years?
That's how they structured the cap relief. So
okay.
It's sort of this ongoing thing where the government acknowledges that it's a problem but refuses to fix it, right? So what Congress has done, instead of a permanent fix to the cap, they've sort of done these one-off Band-Aids. So several years ago, it was a flat-out returning worker exemption, meaning If you previously had an H2B visa, we're not going to count you against the cap. That sort of evolved into this idea of, well, it's a returning worker exemption, sort of, right? We'll set a certain amount of returning worker visas that we'll allow. And then we'll set a separate allotment if you're coming from a country that we prefer, right? So this was something that came out of the first Trump administration, where I think Trump and his foreign policy folks at the time really saw this as sort of a geopolitical bargaining chip. I'm sure you remember the migrant caravans coming up through Central America. The deal that was struck at the time was, if you, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, whatever, if you help us police these migrant caravans and you prevent those migrant caravans from making it to the U.S., we will reward you with more legal pathways to come here via the H2B program. So that's what started this. It sort of morphed from a pure returning worker exemption into a returning worker exemption plus a separate visa allotment for what they called at the time the Northern Triangle. Under Biden, we saw that program expand pretty dramatically. And so Biden brought on additional countries. So we saw Colombia, Ecuador, we saw a number of other countries get added to that list, and we saw the allotment go up. So there was actually more visas made available on top of what was put into the statutory cap.
What would you say the number one country is that most of these visas are coming out of?
Yeah.
Mexico's number one by a pretty wide margin.
Is there a reason for that?
I think it's a combination of reasons. One, I think being our next door neighbor, I think Mexico just enjoys a level of privilege that, if you're Guatemala or Honduras, you just don't have that kind of relationship with the U.S. We have a lot of American citizens that have family in Mexico, and we have a lot of Americans that have roots in Mexico. So Mexico has always enjoyed this special place as far as being a labor supply country. Economics are another motivating factor, because employers are on the hook. If you're going to participate in the program, you have to pay the cost of the workers getting here. And it's a lot cheaper to get on a bus from Monterrey, Mexico, than it is to hop on a flight from Tegucigalpa, right? So historically, I think cost has been a major factor as well. And just the size of Mexico. Mexico's a huge, diverse country. They have a huge labor pool to pull from.
But then also hitting off of that, getting them to come here, paying for them to come here, then you have to pay for their housing. You have to pay for all of their other things, right, while they're here as well, not just their wages?
Well, you have to pay for them to get here, but once they're here, in the H2B program, you're generally not on the hook for housing costs.
Okay.
So
all right.
Housing is a requirement in the H2A agricultural program, right? So
Got it.
If you're a farmer and you're bringing in farm workers through the H2A program, you have to provide free housing. That's sort of a norm in that program. That's not the case in H2B. So in H2B, workers are generally free to sign apartment leases. They've kind of figured it out on their own. Some employers do choose to help with that, whether they're paying for it or chipping in to help subsidize it, or just steering them in the right direction. Typically, employers do choose some form of assistance with housing. But
that's what I was going to say, because
there's no regulatory requirement that they pay for.
Yeah. If they're only here for a short amount of time, I feel like that's going to be really hard to go into an apartment complex and get some sort of good feeling that they're going to not pay, but it's like they put this application and it's like, how do I trust this person that's only been here for 6 months? So I feel like at that point, or not even that long, but I feel at that point an employer has to step in a little bit to help out.
Yeah, and especially you can imagine, there are H2B workers going to Martha's Vineyard. You can imagine how difficult it would be to find affordable housing there, or high net worth area of the U.S. What we typically see is that employers do offer some form of assistance, even if it's not financial. Sometimes it's just being the guarantor of a lease. If you're going to a landlord and saying, "Hey, I'm bringing in 5 to 10 workers. I'm willing to be the guarantor of a lease. Maybe we can work out a special deal on the length of the lease to, maybe match the contract period." there's a lot of ways that employers can be helpful. You can imagine, just from a humanitarian standpoint, it can be a little intimidating to expect a worker, maybe they've never even been to the U.S., to try to negotiate with an American landlord to find an affordable apartment. I mean, a lot of them just
that's my
aren't going to
point.
have the capacity to do that.
Right. So on the loyalty of the program as a whole, it doesn't sound like that word really coincides with this at all. I would feel like if I got 10 workers, then I would want those 10 workers over and over again, and I should be able to get them over and over again. Obviously, I feel entitled at that point, but I feel like I should be able to get them over and over again without having to keep going back into this whole application process and then possibly getting them and possibly not, because there's first timers coming in. So it just doesn't feel like there is a loyalty to the program. It's just you're still at risk no matter what, even though you have been in it for 5 to 10 years, possibly, and getting the same people, right?
Well, yeah, and that's one of the areas where the industry has pushed for reform. So historically, I mentioned that cap relief has sort of been a fixture for a long time now, and Congress keeps doing the one-off fixes. What's interesting is that the fix has either been, hey, we're just going to flat out give you some additional visas to pull from, right? Like in the case of the Northern Triangle allotment, or we're going to make it contingent on the workers being returning. And that's great. I mean, ideal situation, if you could script it, you'd have the same workers year after year, right? Because they come in, they know your business, they know the routine, they can kind of hit the ground running on day one. That's the ideal for sure. The problem with that is that still creates problems within the program, and it doesn't solve the cap issue. One concept that has been floated now that the industry has really rallied behind is the idea that let's not make the exemption at the worker level. Let's make the exemption at the employer level.
Mm-hmm.
So Moss and any number of our industry allies, we've been lobbying for cap relief. We're a founding member of the Seasonal Employment Alliance. C does great work as far as advocating for the industry. C has really been the champion of this certified seasonal employer concept, where if you are a repeat user of the program, if you are a long-time H2B dependent business, you would be exempt from the cap as a business. Meaning you don't have to worry about this lottery every year because you've already demonstrated that you have a need, and you would still have the flexibility to bring back your returning workers, but you as a business wouldn't have to worry about the cap consideration. And what that would do, if that concept made it through, one, you would have a lot more stability as far as that loyalty you're talking about. I've been in the business for X number of years. I deserve to have my workers. Why should I compete with the new people? But it also frees up visas for the new people, right?
Yeah.
So if you have the longtime program users essentially taken care of, that 66,000 allotment goes a lot further with people that are just getting into the program that aren't eligible for that returning seasonal employer exemption.
100%. Yeah.
Is there I would assume a spring cutoff is that more used one. So is there a benefit to your season being March 1st? Because that puts you before your April 1st start time. Obviously, you need to be able to prove that that's when your seasonality starts.
Realistically, I would say that most people using the program legitimately have a March start date. It's just that they have to artificially make it April 1st because of the cap. So in the old days, I say old days meaning, 7, 8 years ago. 7, 8 years ago, you could generally kind of get to a late February, maybe even early March start date, and there would still be visas from that first half allotment. There's only so many ski resorts out there, right, that are having workers over the winter. So it was generally possible that there would still be some visas left over from that first half, and you could get a start date late February, early March, when most people start ramping up for the season. In the last 5 years, that's really become really difficult. And we start to see that the visas would get exhausted earlier and earlier every year to now. I don't know. I tend to think if you're not requesting workers in October, you have a very low probability of getting through. It tends to be an October cutoff or bust. Maybe you can get away with maybe the first week in November if demand is low. But as the spring, visas have been under pressure, it's also spilled over, and some of that pressure is falling into the winter allotment.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of application and things like that, what would you warn companies from doing? Like, what have you seen companies do wrong that has gotten them in trouble? They cut some corners here. They did some.
Probably the number one thing that's a don't do in the H2B program is don't lie about your labor need, right?
Okay.
And this is something that, you submit this paperwork to the government, you're doing it under penalty of perjury. And if you misrepresent your labor need, it is fraud. They will put you in jail for that, right? So you just need to be very careful about being true and accurate in anything you put in that application, right? So you want to always be true and honest about when you need workers and how many workers you need and what you're going to have them doing. Because if you have workers that are working outside of what you said they'd be doing, that can be a form of fraud. I think the real danger is as employers get desperate, they start looking for ways to cut corners, right? Because if you're playing a lottery, I get it. You're playing a lottery with your business. You have revenue on the line. You don't want to lose that. You start looking for ways, well, maybe we can swap visas. Maybe you have some extra capacity on your contract. We'll move the workers over to me. I'll borrow them. That's when it gets really dangerous, right? And people have gone to jail for that. So
Really?
kind of the illegal visa swaps, visa trades, there's legitimate ways to change employers on an H2B visa and to move around as needed. But then there are plenty of illegitimate ways to do it as well. And you just need to make sure that, you talk to a professional to understand if what you're doing is above board.
What's the vetting process on the employee? So I have my visas. I'm now ready to hire people. Can I just hire anyone in these countries? Are they doing background checks? Are they obviously making sure they're all good people before they come over?
I don't know about good people, but no. The way to think about it is that as an employer, you're free to offer employment to anybody you want, provided that they meet the job requirements. So if you have job requirements in there, you need to make sure that any foreign workers you're hiring meet those requirements. If they don't meet the requirements and you advertised a job requirement, believe it or not, the government views that as a form of discrimination against hypothetical U.S. applicants. Maybe if that experience requirement wasn't actually required, maybe the hypothetical U.S. applicant would have applied for that job. Once you make a determination that a worker is qualified, that they meet all the job requirements, you're free to offer them employment. That does not guarantee that the State Department will find them admissible and eligible for a visa. So the State Department has pretty broad latitude to vet any foreign applicant for any visa status. And if there's something in that worker's history that makes them inadmissible, like prior illegal presence, that can be grounds for denying them a visa. So, I wouldn't say it's not like a formal background check, but you'd be amazed at how much shows up in the State Department system, right? I mean, traffic tickets from 10 years ago, or things like that. Petty crimes can show up. And especially now under the Trump administration, I think there's a much greater focus on criminal history. Even traffic citations and things like that can come up in the record. But certainly prior illegal presence. If they've ever been in the U.S. illegally, one, you'd be amazed at how much the government actually knows about prior illegal presence. But they're looking back further and further in history to find out. Under the Biden administration, I think if it was ancient history, they could gloss over it and say, okay, you had a clean record for the last 5 to 10 years, you're good to go. Now I'm not so sure. I think even if you were in the U.S. illegally 10, 15 years ago, that can still be a basis for denying you entry on an H2 visa.
Thinking back on this too now of just the liability and everything, and you're talking about priors and things like that. you get a guy that comes over here and he commits a crime or something happens or he takes off. Am I liable? Who's liable here?
So employers don't have kind of general liability. You know, it's not a situation where you're acting as a guarantor for every single thing that that worker does. Um, you know, your obligation as an employer is to follow all the labor laws, follow all the program rules. You do have to apprise workers of their obligation to leave the U.S. after their status is up. Other than that, if a worker commits a crime or they do something they shouldn't be doing, the employer is not liable for that. That responsibility falls directly to the worker. And there have been instances, I mean, thankfully it doesn't happen often, but there have been workers who committed crimes or whatever, and you know, they now I would say there's a really high probability that they'll get deported before there's even court proceedings. That tends to be what happens. But you know, we've had workers that maybe they get a DUI. Under some of the new laws and some of the new enforcement mechanisms under this administration, it's pretty much guaranteed that they'll be subject to removal proceedings from the U.S. and sent home.
So I was just thinking of what might keep owners up, you know, legally wise on that aspect of it.
If I bring over guys and they don't leave, I did everything on my end. I got them a plane ticket, a bus ticket, or however, whatever means to get to their home. Does that look bad on me as the employer? Because obviously that's something you'd have to worry about, I would assume. I mean,
Sure.
maybe prior to this administration, I think guys wanted to stay. I think now.
I don't think employers get a black mark on their record or anything. You know, there is a duty to report if workers abscond, if they go AWOL. You as an employer have a duty to report that, and there can be fines and penalties if you don't report it. But generally, there's no expectation that you're sort of, you know, on the hook for them doing something illegal. The thing to keep in mind though is that this doesn't happen very often. It seems like it ought to happen more given the numbers that are involved. You would think a greater number would actually be out there committing crimes or overstaying and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
The interesting thing to me is that by and large, if they're in the program, these are workers who want to do it the legal way, right? They're intentionally making a choice of saying, I am choosing not to do it the illegal way. I'm choosing not to do things that are, you know, crossing the Rio Grande or whatever, paying human traffickers, however you get into the U.S. illegally. I'm choosing not to do it that way. I'm choosing to do it the legal way. And actually, I as a worker benefit from that, right? I do have an elevated wage. I have much greater earning potential. I have much greater protections, legal protections as a worker. So I think workers are very much incentivized to play by the rules because it's a good gig. I mean, if you think about what workers are making doing the same job in Mexico or Honduras or Guatemala, US dollars a day equivalent. I mean, compared to they might be making 15, 16, 17, 19 an hour doing that same job in the US on an H2B contract. So as a worker, I mean, the number one thing that they want is to be invited back. And anything that can jeopardize their ability to come back, I think is something that they generally want to avoid. And it's to the point where when employers legally obtain an extension on the contract and they say, hey, we need an extra 2 weeks or whatever to finish our work, and you get a formal government approval, I'm amazed by how many workers are skeptical of that. And they say, well, my document says this end date, I have to be out by that time. And
There's
new approval.
There's a hard stamp date on their documents?
Yeah, they have what's called an I-94, and it's an arrival departure record, and it basically you can go to the U.S. Customs and Border Protection website, you can pull it up, and it says when they were admitted to the U.S. and how long they're authorized to stay in the U.S.
So they get here, you get lucky, you have an April start date. Can they go home and come back?
They can, yeah. Yeah, H2B is what's known as a multi-entry visa. So it's not a situation where they have to get a new visa every time they come in. So we have workers that go home for a home visit, whether maybe they go home for a wedding or they go home for the birth of a child or just for any number of reasons, vacation even. They're perfectly allowed to do that. Probably the only restriction that I would say they need to be mindful of is that they can't be absent for too long, right? If they're gone for more than about 30 days, CBP has the ability to reject them and force them to go back and get a new visa from the consulate.
Okay. But if they had to get home for some reason, a birth, like you said, a death in the family, something like
Sure.
that, they are able to be home for that.
Yeah, and in that situation, we typically recommend that they carry a letter with them, especially if they're going home via, car or bus or something like that. Carry a letter from the employer saying, hey, I'm giving them permission to leave. They're going to be gone for a week or whatever it is. I expect them to be back on X date. That's just a good practice because God forbid they get pulled over by law enforcement or immigration.
Mm-hmm.
It's helpful to be able to say like, nope, I'm here legally. I'm on my way back. I'm going home for a wedding. I have my employer's permission. I'm not absconding. I'm not going AWOL. That's always helpful.
Okay, that makes sense.
So, Tom, for the future of H2B, what needs to change, do you think?
The cap is the number one thing that needs to change because the cap, first of all, the idea of the cap, it's actually interesting when you look back at the history of it. The cap was created almost as a compromise, because there was opposition to things like H1B. Even back then there was opposition to it.
There still is today.
So those political issues have not been resolved in the 30 plus years. But yeah, the idea was, and at the time, if you look back at where the H2B program was in 1990, it was kind of a backwater visa program. Nobody even knew what it was. Very few people were coming in on H2B visas. So when Congress created the cap and said, well, we'll stick a 66,000 limit on it, that was actually like, they considered that an absurd number. They considered it like, oh, we'll never hit 66,000. Fast forward 10, 20 years, and suddenly 66,000 is woefully inadequate, right? And unfortunately, H2B occupies this very weird space in American politics because the extreme left and the extreme right hate the program for very different reasons, and none of them understand it. And so you have this strange bedfellows class of sort of more thoughtful members of Congress who do understand it and who do, maybe they're in states that are heavily dependent on H2B, like Maine.
Mm-hmm.
Its seafood industry is hugely dependent on H2B. It's amazing how those, you have those people from different sides of the political spectrum coming together to say, this is a problem that needs to be fixed because this has major economic consequences. And what's always been interesting to me is even as the Trump administration takes a very hardline, aggressive stance on mass deportations, and we got to shut down the border, and we got to block all this, and let's end humanitarian visa programs. Very aggressive stance on all immigration issues. There still seems to be a soft spot for the H2 visas, H2A and H2B. I think not only because the president uses the programs. I mean, there are H2B workers at Mar-a-Lago. There's H2B workers at Trump National Golf Course. It's important to the economy, and all these businesses depend on it. And it actually is sort of a relief mechanism if you are going to have mass deportations. So if you disrupt the economy and you get rid of a huge number of workers who are here illegally, somebody has to do the work. And if you don't have American workers, it's not that American workers don't want the jobs, it's that there's not enough Americans in some of these areas. I mean, a lot of H2B employers are located in very remote areas where the labor pool just can't support it. So I think if you understand the economic consequences, you would say, man, this cap is a real problem and we need a long-term fix. It's not just about, where to put the cap number. It's, how do we have enough visas to go around to meet the demand and to allow returning employers who have depended on it to continue getting priority while still allowing new program participants to enter the program if they need workers, right? That's the challenge.
So owners need to be out here advocating for more.
100%. If you're in a labor intensive industry, whether you've used the H2B program or not, chances are you're going to use it eventually. What I would say is you should be contacting your members of Congress and pushing for a solution to the cap problem.
Oh, I got a good one for you now that I just thought about that. So Nate is a company, they travel all over the country. How does that work with the program in terms of Department of Labor for the wages? So Nate could be in Alabama today and New Jersey tomorrow doing a job.
Yeah, I mean, you do have to obtain a prevailing wage for each location. So
they're union at the end of the day then.
Well, if you're unionized and you're part of a collective bargaining agreement, that collective bargaining wage will govern.
Right, but I'm saying we're not union, but from what you're saying then is if that wage has to prevail in different areas, and you're ultimately just like a union.
To an extent, I mean, it's still a mandated wage rate. As an employer, you're still not having the full autonomy to set the wage where you need it to be. You're paying what the government tells you to pay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to figure out wherever you would work that'd be the most expensive, and basically that's what you're paying all year.
Okay, yeah, I got you now.
Yeah, so it's about paying a wage rate that the government feels is appropriate for,
a U.S. worker, basically.
It's basically trying to protect the wages and working conditions of American workers is fundamentally what it comes down to.
Well, and I think it just goes back to what you said and how companies and government just don't understand it. I think a lot of people in our industry just don't understand it. H2B is becoming more of a thing in our industry. I feel like over the past, Kyle, 3 years or so, it's really starting to take off more and more.
As the labor market's gotten harder and harder. Since
harder
COVID,
and harder,
basically.
Yeah, and I feel like it's starting to take off, but nobody really understands. Everybody wants to dip their toe into it, but nobody wants to jump into it. A few people have jumped into it in this industry and finally have explained it a little bit, but then it scares them away when you talk about this lottery process, or you have to provide housing for them, or it's just like it makes it so unpredictable for the future. So at that point, I'm like, to me, are you optimistic for the future about this future of this program and how this looks?
Optimistic in the sense that the program has become important enough to get into the national conversation, right? And that means that something is going to give eventually, right? Because if it's a backwater program and it has no, if there's not that many people using it, and generally it's you have a subset of businesses that don't represent a huge economic impact, you're not going to get Congress to do much of anything. The more the economy relies on it, it starts to get attention, and you start to see solutions creep in. And so I'm more optimistic now about long-term prospects for cap relief and cap reform than I have been I've been at masLabor for 10 years. I feel better about it now than I did 5-10 years ago.
Really?
I think
I would have thought that it would have been. I would have thought that it would have been opposite.
Well, you would think that, right? I mean, it probably scares a lot of folks to look at someone like Donald Trump that has a very aggressive immigration enforcement to say this is going to be the end of the H2B program. Very easy to say that until you realize that all the arguments are in favor of not restricting H2B, but expanding it.
I also think you need to look at if H2B disappeared tomorrow, what would actually happen to this country. I think that, going back to you talking about the fish markets that I didn't even think about up north, that's crazy to think about.
Or you
just
said
all the
ski
labor
resorts.
there.
There's only so many ski resorts.
Ski
resorts. You don't think
resorts.
that those are running off of H2B workers, but once you said
golf
golf
courses and country clubs. I mean, that's huge. So it's just what happens to this country when if this disappeared tomorrow?
Well, what's telling to me, and this is where everybody kind of showed their hand, was during COVID, right? Because during COVID, famously, the president shut down the border. We're going to have nobody coming in across the border, right? And we're going to have travel restrictions, and we're going to have this, that, and the other thing to limit the number of people coming into the United States. Basically, the next day, we get, an official determination from the State Department and from Homeland Security that says, well, we're going to restrict everyone from coming into the country unless you're an essential worker, right? And H2 workers are essential workers, and so we need them here. And
Mm-hmm.
also, we're going to create some special flexibilities and leeway if you're in the meatpacking industry, right? Or you're in certain industries that are essential for the functioning of the U.S. economy. We're gonna give you some special flexibilities. To me, that tips their hand, because I think
Right.
fundamentally they know how important it is to the American economy. Maybe we don't all like to admit it at times for political reasons, but the reality is that the program is essential for the economy to function. You know, I went on vacation to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, right? You want to talk
My
about
favorite place in the country.
you want to talk about a town that runs on H2B? Look no further than Jackson Hole,
Mm-hmm.
because that's a very wealthy area. You have a lot of billionaires, and you know Kanye West has a house out there. There is not a sufficient local population that can keep all those hospitality establishments up and running.
Well, and I would assume the workers couldn't afford to live there.
Of course not,
Correct.
right? They're priced out of the area. So I drive around.
I'm priced out of the area.
I drive around Jackson, Wyoming, and every other there's a client, there's a client, there's a client. You do the same thing in any resort town in America, whether it's Bozeman or West Yellowstone or Vail. Any of those towns really rely on the H2B program, and that's to say nothing of Alaskan seafood, Maine seafood, Louisiana seafood. You mentioned golf courses. Every country club in America is facing some constraints on labor, so that's a huge
Mm-hmm.
program demographic as well. People don't really understand how deep the H2B program goes as far as sort of these essential jobs that keep things moving.
And I feel like then if this doesn't continue on and people don't get enough of what they need, that's when the illegal activity starts. Is people start to bring people on and then find out that they're illegal when you could have just gone through the process. So if they give us more, it's more legal people to be able to put on your workforce, and do bigger, different jobs. So what do you think, just to wrap up here a little bit, Tom, what do you think the best advice for a first-time H2B employer would be?
Go in with realistic expectations about what you want to accomplish, right? Because ultimately you're looking to solve a labor need, and you're looking to solve it in a way that is inherently imperfect, right? The H2B program is not perfect. And it's not perfect because there's a lot of burdensome regulatory requirements. There's a lot of hoops that you have to jump through that you wouldn't ordinarily have to jump through as an employer. And then you have the cap, which means it's uncertain if or when you will actually get your workers. You sort of have to just be mentally prepared for that. And what I would say is, over time, you get to a point where you can make it work. Thousands of employers make it work for their businesses, right? Even with the uncertainty. I think with people that are not seasoned pros of the H2B program, if they're sort of just getting started, it's very hard to swallow that pill, right? And it's easy to get frustrated, and it's easy to sort of throw your hands up and give up. What I tend to find is that the people that get into the program, let's say year one, they have a bad lottery result. And then year two, they say, I'm out. This was a waste of time. Year three rolls around, they're right back at it. And so don't get frustrated. Just accept that things are tricky. The overwhelming probability with cap relief is that you will get your workers at some point, or you'll get some subset of them. It's just a matter of when. And so there are some viable strategies to mitigate it. It's not a lottery where it's all or nothing and that's the end of the story. There are strategies to mitigate it, whether it's, trying to pursue a winter strategy for, kind of the tail end, and then you have a cap exemption through that mechanism. You can transfer workers who are here already on H2B visas. Those don't count against the cap. And then there's cap relief, which every year has come in some form or another that has expanded the availability of visas. So just being mentally prepared and understanding that it may not be perfect, but if you stick with it, you can make it work for your business.
So what I'm getting is educate yourselves and plan early are the main factors.
And
Absolutely.
use professionals.
and
Well,
use professionals like
that goes
yourself.
without saying. It's.
Well, at the end,
I cannot imagine being an employer trying to navigate this on your own.
man, and as the labor pool, like we've hit over this podcast, it's become smaller and smaller. This stuff decides whether events happen or not for us. Whether or not we can finish our jobs, we hit our quotas, what we need to hit, and what we need to do. So, I really appreciate you coming on today and just kind of cutting through that bullshit. Just getting straight to the point on it and just telling us everything we need to hear. Because I feel like I said, over the past 3 years, it's become more of a thing in our industry, and the labor isn't going to get better. I don't know why. We're trying to make it better with education and everything else and trying to bring more people in. But in the meantime, at least, the H2B program we need to keep around. There is a place for it. It needs to be here. People need to advocate for it and be educated on it. So, I really appreciate this, and I'd love to get you back on later on and kind of see where we're at with this.
More questions after this. So
so we'll get some listeners' questions.
While I'm here, feel free to load me up with any questions you want. I'm happy to talk through.
Well, Tom, if you could kind of give the listeners too an idea of where they can reach you or reach out to you if they have any questions or masLabor in case they need to go through this process with you.
Yeah, you can find us on masLabor.com, MASLABOR, and we'd be happy to talk to you about H2B or any other labor needs you have. So visit our website, give us a call. We're happy to chat.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Tom. Thanks for coming on today and giving us a little insight on that. And this has been another episode of Under the Vinyl, a rental management media podcast. Have a good day, bye.